Well, thank you, Olivia. It's a pleasure to be back talking about some of the simulation models we found using the EBRI model. This is going to be a little bit different than what you just heard, and I want to make sure everyone is familiar with some of the differences between the types of models we're running at EBRI and some of the others, just to make sure there's no confusion in terms of the overall conclusions here. The EBRI retirement security projection model is actually something we've been running since the late 1990s. This is something that started as an initiative from some of the states, Oregon, Kansas, Massachusetts. We're very concerned about how future generations of retirees were going to fare because, of course, they would be on the hook once the retiree became financially indigent. They were primarily interested in having to pay for Medicaid costs, et cetera. So we did 3 different models. We then expanded it to a full national model in 2003. But I want to be very clear on what the objective function is for our model, because it is very different from many of the other models that you hear about. First of all, given that the initial stakeholders, remember the states themselves, the governors of the states, were interested in determining what percentage of future retirement cohorts should run short of money retirement, and almost as importantly, when they would run short of money. It makes a difference if you're running short first year you're retired versus after 20 or 30 years. That the development of this model did not rely on a replacement rate target for a number of reasons. Obviously, if you're using a replacement rate target, there's no ability to tell when a household is going to run short of money in retirement. You're making a point determination at age 65, and you either are or are not going to have sufficient funds. As we know from the real world, very few households annuitize all or even most of their individual accounts in retirement. So therefore, when we considered using replacement rate focus, we knew it would completely overlook any potential longevity risk, a real consideration. It typically doesn't account for post-retirement investment risk. And one of the biggest obstacles we found in all the years we've been doing this simulation work is if you look at families on the verge of retirement who look like they may have sufficient financial resources, but then end up running short of money in retirement, in many cases it's because of long-term care costs. And if you're going to use a replacement rate model, again, like with the annuitization experience, in the real world, very few retirees have long-term care insurance, at least of sufficient magnitude to cover these costs. So consequently, any attempt to try to incorporate some kind of simple replacement rate threshold needs to be very, very carefully assessed against any of the actual real-world implications. I'm going to go very, very quickly through some of the details of the retirement security projection model, again, just so you have a better idea when I get to the results what they actually mean, and more importantly, their implications in terms of how retirement plans work towards this overall retirement income adequacy. It's a microsimulation model. We've got 2 phases. The accumulation phase, we simulate retirement income and wealth for boomers and Gen Xers. We look at DC plans, DB plans, IRAs. We look at rollovers. We look at Roths. We look at traditional. We look at Social Security, both status quo and under some reform options. And we look at net housing equity. The way we're able to do this, we don't use Survey of Consumer Finance data. It's incredibly unreliable if you look at the actual generosity people attribute to themselves in terms of what they're going to end up with. So we have a time series of pension plan generosity parameters from several hundred plans going back for several decades. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, other than Social Security, if you're going to be looking at Gen Xers and baby boomers, the single most important component of retirement wealth is going to be from the defined contribution plans. And now that we've shifted from a DB to a DC scheme, to try to understand how this is going to accumulate in terms of wealth, you have to be able to model the employee decision-making in terms of participation, contribution, asset allocation, and rollovers. Fortunately, in conjunction with ICI, we built the largest 401k database in the country. We've got 401k asset allocation and contribution behavior on individual administrative records, in some cases going all the way back to 1996. Currently, we have more than 24 million employees and 60,000 plans. As far as the retirement phase, once we get them up to retirement age, typically we baseline retirement age of 65, but we've also been doing studies looking at the impact of deferring it. We simulate 1,000 alternative life paths for each household, starting at 65. We have deterministic modeling for things that basically, once you know the income and the age, you got a pretty good handle on things like food, apparel, services, transportation, entertainment, reading, education, housing, and basic health expenditures that you know are going to be incurred every year. The Medicare premia, the Medigap premia, basic out-of-pocket expenses. The part, though, that is incredibly difficult, but I think makes this model incredibly useful in looking at the real world, is the next part on the stochastic modeling, where we actually look at longevity risk, we actually look at investment risk, and then most importantly, the nursing facility care and home-based health care. Bottom line is, when we get through all this modeling, we produce something called retirement readiness rating. It's going to be between 0 and 100%. It's a percentage of simulated life paths that do not run short of money in retirement. So a large retirement readiness rating is a good thing in this particular model. I'm going to very quickly go through a number of figures just to give you some baselines and then get you to the real important part of this presentation, how do retirement plans basically impact this. What figure 1 is trying to do, breaking out by early boomers, late boomers, and Gen Xers, what percentage of the households will have sufficient retirement income at different thresholds. The bottom, if you look at the bottom line on the grid, that's 100% of simulated expense threshold. So it's looking, if you look in the very bottom left-hand corner, what that's saying is if you include long-term care costs, 56.7% of the early boomers are able to have enough money to cover 100% of the simulated expenses, whether they be the stochastic expenses or deterministic. Some people say that's a little bit too constraining, that people will start cutting back from average expenses if they start running short of money, so we also run it at 90 and 80%. So if you go one number above the 56.7%, you can see we add another 10.7%. Basically, we're getting to the situation where about 2/3 of the people are covered if we only have a 90% threshold. If you really want to be lax in your standards and go up to an 80% threshold, you can see that slightly more than 80% of the early boomers are going to be okay. If you look at the column right next to it, those are the same numbers, the same thresholds, but if we just magically make believe that long-term care costs are not insured or not incurred by these individuals, that shows you basically how much difference you have. In essence, we have about a 15 percentage point increase in retirement readiness rating if we can just assume long-term care costs are not part of the model. Mm-hmm. The other thing I just want to quickly note as you go across early boomer, late boomer, and Gen Xer, unlike other models, things don't get worse for the earlier cohorts. We find that the Gen Xers basically have exactly the same retirement readiness ratings as do the boomers. Going to go very quickly through some of the next graphs. Figure 2 is exactly the same as the previous figure, but instead of looking at age cohorts, we look at income quartile. I'm sure it comes as no surprise here that the lowest income quartile has a much lower overall retirement readiness rating. Again, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, only 17% of the lowest income quartile have enough financial resources to have 100% of simulated expenses. If you stay with the with category, it goes up to 52% for the second quartile, 71% for the third, and all the way up to 86% for the highest income quartile. Now, this is the one that I want to spend a couple minutes on because the whole point of this paper was to try to show how retirement plans impact retirement income adequacy. What this does is look only at the Gen Xers because they still have a number of years before they hit retirement age, and looks at future years of eligibility, whether or not they choose to participate, future years of eligibility in a DC plan. Again, if you look at the bottom left-hand number in the grid, 40% of those individuals who don't work for an employer in the future, who sponsor a DC plan, 40% of those will be ready for retirement at 100%. But if you only go to the next category, 1 to 9 years, you've had a 50% increase as far as overall retirement readiness from 40% to 60%. And if you go all the way to the right-hand side, individuals who have future years of eligibility of 20 or more, you're in a situation where it's more than doubled up to 85%. The next couple of graphs are basically just showing you how quickly individuals run short of money in retirement. If you want to just, for example, focus about 10 years out, we see that the highest income quartile, only about 2% of them will run short of money after 10 years, but that lowest income quartile, it's all the way up to 73%. And you can obviously take that out over the various time patterns. Figure 7 looks at the same thing, but instead of looking at income quartile, now looks at longevity. So I basically break each individual down into respective cells based on family age and family and age status, and basically look at the individuals who die relatively early. They're the blue line on the bottom. Obviously, in many cases, these are individuals who are going to pass away before they end up running short of money. But basically, this graph shows, especially out towards the end, just how much longevity risk plays in to that overall determination. Figure 8 is exactly the same thing, but instead of looking at longevity risk, now we're looking at long-term care risk. I break these into quartiles of what the present value of long-term care costs are at 65, and basically you see a very similar situation. Skipping quickly past all the regression results. So had you heard the entire presentation, this was the takeaway. Basically, what about DB plans? The presence of just having a DB accrual at 65, regardless of size, although we do additional breakouts based on size, obviously, will basically increase your retirement readiness rating by 11.6 percentage points. DC plans, future eligibility for Gen Xers is one of the most important components we find in this model. As I've already mentioned, for those with no future years of eligibility, only 2 out of 5 are going to have adequate retirement income. You take that all the way out to the far end of the extreme, 20 or more years, you can more than double that up to 86%. But the bottom line is, regardless of how risky things are today, with or without pension plans, much of this could be circumvented if individuals would just practice appropriate risk management techniques, things like longevity risk and things like long-term care risk through partial annuitization and or purchase of long-term care insurance could get people a long way towards alleviating the current situation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.